All right. Well, James, welcome to That Fitness Couple.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Really excited to have this conversation. And one of the primary reasons why I wanted you specifically on this show is because you have probably analyzed more statistical data around resistance training than arguably anyone on the planet. Most certainly anybody in exercise science, probably exercise science and the fitness industry in general combined. And I always feel like you bring such amazing data to the conversation that really what we wanted to do today was take a lot of that data that you've done and the research and really break it down and help people to understand how this applies from a practical standpoint. So I think a good starting place, though, is just to let's begin with one of the more recent studies that you had done. You've been involved in several recently, but the two in particular that I'm talking about are the ones that had to do with resistance training at different muscle lengths. And if you don't mind just giving our audience a brief overview of what the research was about and what was being set out to be proved or disproved, I think we begin with that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So many of the listeners, I'm sure, will probably be aware that this one of the current kind of popular trends within the resistance training literature and within the kind of social media realm where people discuss the research around resistance training is this concept of lengthened partial range of motion training, and the role that kind of muscle length plays on hypertrophic adaptation, so increases in muscle size. So I was involved in two projects recently. I should probably preface this by saying one of our previous PhD students, Milo Wolf, who's been quite sort of a proponent of these methods, has a lot of the work kind of stemmed from his original PhD research, which is around the role of range of motion, and whether or not we see differences in terms of training with a partial range of motion versus training with a full range of motion. And particularly one of the things that came out of some of his original work at the beginning of his PhD, where he conducted a meta-analysis, where, for those who don't know what a meta-analysis is, we do a instead of relying on one single study, we search the literature, we pull in all the studies that are relevant for a particular topic, and then where individual studies typically in our field are quite small and we can't necessarily put too much confidence in their findings alone, we pool all of these together and statistically analyze them all to get a more kind of robust answer to the question that we're interested in. And there was some suggestion that there might be better results potentially. But although even in the context of the meta-analysis in this case, it was quite unclear. But it suggested maybe if you were doing partial range of motion training, but at a longer muscle length, so where the muscle is more stretched relative to its resting position, that you might see slightly greater improvements in muscle hypertrophy. So the work I've been involved in recently has kind of built on that concept, which is kind of popularized from there. So one of them was actually, again, another meta-analysis, which was led by another PhD student, Dorian Varovic. Also involved Milo, also involved Brad Schoenfeld and a few other collaborators like Jozo Gergic. And in this one particularly, what we specifically looked at were studies that had taken different training interventions, manipulated the range of motion in them, such that the muscle length which was trained at was typically different across those interventions. So in some interventions, you tended to train with a longer average muscle length than in others. So, for example, if you were training in the more extended part of a range of motion, your mean muscle length during training would be a bit longer than if you were training with sort of shorter reps. And with that, we specifically looked at the impact of the muscle length during training on regional hypertrophy. So did we see differences in terms of proximal hypertrophy closer to the muscle insertion, distal hypertrophy further from that insertion, or like in the sort of like mid portion of the muscle? So that was the first one I was been involved in, and we built on, like I say, Milo's original work there, and in this, we had a lot more data to work with than we did originally in Milo's meta-analysis. So we were able to pull more studies in. We were able to get more precise estimates of the effects here. And if there is a tiny benefit or a benefit from manipulating muscle length during training, what we found in this was that it is incredibly small. And it's probably too small for anyone to care about really. Which is not to say that like manipulating muscle length isn't worth doing. There could be other reasons for manipulating things in your training. You can keep it fresh, keep it interesting, so on and so forth. But in terms of the changes, the differences in muscle hypertrophy that you might get from training with a longer muscle length versus a shorter muscle length, the data in this meta-analysis suggested it really didn't make too much of a difference. So that was the first one. And then the most recent one that we've been involved in was another collaboration with colleagues at Discover Strength. So Luke Carlson and David Schneider were instrumental in us being able to conduct this study, which was another study looking at the effects of length and partial training versus traditional full range of motion training. Now, I should sort of say here as well, this is again like one study. I've just been talking about meta-analyses and the importance of us being able to kind of pool all of the data together and not rely on single studies. I'm going to make an exception for this one study though, because this is without a doubt the biggest randomized controlled trial in resistance training literature that I'm certainly aware of. It was a fully transparent, incredibly rigorous piece of research. I won't go too much into the nitty-gritty of the statistical details and stuff like that, but to let everyone know, we did what was called a pre-registration. So for those who don't know that, most people think that with science you start off with a hypothesis and you kind of make these predictions and then you go test those predictions and you try and prove yourself wrong. That's the kind of blue skies picture that most people have. Unfortunately, that's not actually how a lot of science is done. That's how it should be done. And that's exactly what we did here. We made a very bold claim initially. We pre-registered our hypotheses publicly. We set out all of our methods that we were going to use publicly. And that was all done earlier in the year and time-stamped. And then we went off and did our study with this. And we ended up recruiting just shy of 300 participants for this study. And when you think the typical resistance training study might be lucky if it has 30 participants in it. So incredibly large study. We compared a group that trained with full range of motion for all exercises and a group that trained with a lengthened partial range of motion in their lower body single joint and upper body single joint exercise sizes. So it was kind of reflecting the sort of a lot of the recommendations for maybe how you should apply lengthened partial training in your current training program that have been going around online. And again, what we found was that if there is any difference between them, which from the looks of our data, there probably isn't. And there certainly isn't a difference between them that exceeds what would be considered a meaningful effect threshold. So in all of this recent work, what we've kind of shown is that it really doesn't make a difference whether or not you're training with a full range of motion, a lengthened partial range of motion. In most cases, the gains that you're going to get are going to be incredibly similar. And I think the data is really robust around that now. So that's probably a good summary of what we've been up to recently with those pieces of research.
I'm going to dive in here.
Go for it.
I feel like first of all, that was phenomenal. And my brain is like, wow, this is great. There's definitely a few people listening that are like, what was that all about? So basically, to summarize, you set out to say, hey, is the way that we train, is it possible to make our muscles grow bigger?
Pretty much, yeah. So we start off with that question. Yeah,
like that's too basic. That was like first grade. I could take it up to third grade. But people are always looking for more gains. How can I look more toned, more ripped? Guys typically want to get bigger. I know it's a generalization, but you looked at ways of doing it. So just to revisit what range of motion is, if you're thinking about a bicep curl, it's when you're in that totally like upright, contracted place. You're extending your arm out, right, to the full extended viewpoint, and you were just looking if we could shorten that range of motion. The range in which you would exercise, could that impact muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth? I also, go ahead. I have one more thing.
The idea was that when you are in that extended position, if you were to just work that half of the exercise, that half where the stretch is the most intense. So for somebody who's doing a chest press, that might be in that bottom position where there's a big stretch. For somebody who's doing pull downs, it's when you're at the top of the range of motion and there's a big stretch on the muscles. So the concept here was just quite simple. It's focus on that part of the range of motion where you're going to get the most intense stretch. And the idea being that, hey, if you just focus on that, you're going to probably maximize muscle, at least through that part of the range of motion, more so than if you were doing another part of the range of motion or the full range of motion.
Pretty much. And Kurodaf, I think you started off with a great question to begin with there, which is we often start with all of these studies with the question of, well, sometimes we don't even ask the question of like, can we make muscles grow bigger? We just assume that we can. That's what resistance training does. And let's be fair, that is a pretty well-established effect. You lift weights, your muscles grow a bit. But one of the interesting things that we've kind of started to question, and which I think a lot of our previous research has shown as well, particularly the studies that we've done with Discover Strength, are that it's actually very hard to continue growing muscle once you're already quite well trained. Now, for some people, that can be quite a sort of like disappointing reality to hear. It was for me when I was a lot younger and I had dreams of being a lot bigger than I am now. But
You and me both.
yeah, but for some people as well, it also becomes a bit kind of freeing to say like, okay, well, what we find is if at a certain point in your training career, it becomes very, very hard to grow any meaningful muscle in the first place, then what that means is almost logically, like any differences between two interventions are going to be incredibly small. And what we've shown with a lot of this research work is, yes, you can continue to grow muscle. The changes are very, very small in trained persons. And if you compare different ways of training, so for example, in this case, manipulating the range of motion, so either training with your muscles in a very stretched position versus allowing them to train throughout a full range of motion, the differences between the two are incredibly small. And so another way to look at this is, and this is what I think we've kind of shown over probably the last 10, 15 years of research that we've done, is that there's a lot of flexibility in how you can train. There's a few principles that you need to kind of focus on, which is, consistency is the main one. You've got to turn up and you've got to train reasonably frequently enough, which is probably not as frequently as most people think, but, you've got to continue training with some degree of frequency consistently, and you've got to train relatively hard. But everything else after that is kind of window dressing, to borrow a term I've heard Bill Simone use. It's stuff that you do not because you think it's going to eke out additional gains, but it's stuff that you do because you might enjoy training a little bit differently this way. You might want to throw in some advanced techniques because it's fun, because we want to be in the gym, we enjoy that. Or if you don't, it's incredibly liberating to go, do you know what? I don't have to focus on all of these things. I can actually just do a very basic, consistent program over time, and I'm going to get everything that I'm going to get out of it, and that's going to be meaningful to me. So it can be very liberating, I think, to look at these results from that perspective. But admittedly, the kind of quote unquote optimizers, the bros who want to grow as much muscle as possible, are probably crying themselves to sleep looking at our latest results.
Well, I love how you summed that up, because, another colleague and friend of ours, Pete Cirqua, he's famous for saying it all works, right? It all works. And I do believe that is very freeing for a lot of people. And what I loved about this study in general was that we deal with a lot of people who come in and maybe they do have pre-existing injuries. And so training through a full range of motion, maybe during that time where they're trying to rehabilitate, or maybe they got an acute injury at some point or another, and they're trying to keep up with their workout program. And a lot of times people just abandon what they're doing altogether because they're like, I can't do anything, or it hurts when I work through this part of the range of motion. So in their mind, they estimate, I can't do anything. I can't do anything. And oftentimes our recommendation as professionals is, hey, let's just work through the range of motion that you feel comfortable with, that's pain-free. And what I love about this is basically showing them that, hey, even during that period of time where you can't train through a full range of motion, or you're experiencing pain in this particular area, just doing something is still going to produce a result. And actually, it may produce the same result as if we were able to do the exercise through a full range of motion. I mean, is that an accurate assessment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's an incredibly good point as well. And one that I didn't mention, but, I'm glad you brought it up, is that not only is this kind of just liberating from the perspective of like, okay, everything works, like I can pick and choose the things I prefer. But in those situations where you specifically, for whatever reason, can't do a particular training approach, it lets you know that okay, I can make these adaptations to accommodate the client, the trainee that I've got in front of me. And I still know that I am providing them with value. I'm providing them with a stimulus that is effective, and I'm able to kind of like adapt to their particular context and still provide them with that. So yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is one of the things very early when I was doing my PhD, one of the first pieces of research that I did was looking at manipulating range of motion during isolated lumbar extension exercise in low back pain. And part of the reason was for that research was specifically because a lot of people with back pain typically will have either extension or flexion preferences. So they'll either have pain exacerbation when they move into flexion, or they'll have pain exacerbation when they move into extension. And it can vary as to why that's the case. But in that specific study, one of the things we did was, well, instead of looking at like the most extended or the most flexed part of the range of motion, we said, well, let's remove both of those and just train through the mid portion of the range of motion. And lo and behold, both groups, both conditions produce similar improvements in strength and similar improvements in pain and disability in the outcomes that we looked at. So there's some real practical benefits to these sorts of things as well for the personal trainer who's working with a unique client who might come in with a specific set of kind of needs that you can't throw a cookie cutter program at them. You've got to adapt. And what a lot of the research nowadays is showing us, I think, is that, like you say, everything works, but the fact that everything works means that you've got all sorts of tools in your toolbox that are effective, but you can use for specific situations.
I love that so much. I mean, that's very encouraging for people. It's move. And I think what I want to actually cover is the three things that you brought up: the consistency, the frequency, and we have to train hard. In your expertise, what do you mean by consistently? And I love how you said you got to turn up.
Well, I mean, eventually, if you stop training, you will start to lose what you've gained. I mean, if it's hard to produce additional gains after a certain period of training, and we've shown that for strength, we've shown that for hypertrophy now, eventually you get to the sad point where it's like what you're doing is not gaining anymore, you are maintaining what you've done. But if you stop training, then you will not maintain what you've produced. So you've got to keep turning up. You've got to keep turning up and providing at least a minimal stimulus to maintain what you've done. And so, if you look at some of these sort of studies that have looked at detraining recently, though, I think even that is something that we see there's probably more flexibility in that than people typically think there is. So I'm going to forget the details off the top of my head because it's not our research specifically, but there have been a number of studies over recent years that have shown, you can take even up to 2 weeks off training and get back to it and still maintain the gains that you've made. I think there was one study recently even that looked at a 4-week detraining period. Once you start to push things out a little bit further than that, then maybe you might start to see more noticeable losses. But even if you're, if for whatever reason a holiday or something like that throws a curveball at you and you can't train for a couple of weeks, that's fine. And, it's not going to cause you to kind of like revert back so suddenly, but getting them back into that consistency in terms of, some sort of minimal training stimulus, even once a week is absolutely sufficient stimulus for the vast majority of people. A little bit more than that. I tend to think as well, to some extent, that a slightly greater frequency can be better way of trying to establish this is in a kind of behavior change sense. Like if you're doing it once a week and you miss one, then it's very easy to kind of like start to fall off the bandwagon a little bit. I'll give you a little kind of background into, I was, God, what are we now? 5 years ago. That seems like such a long time ago now. This is pre-COVID. I was involved in the expert working group who were reviewing the evidence to update the UK physical activity guidelines. And they're very similar to the CDC guidelines and to the World Health Organization guidelines. And you look across the world, most physical activity guidelines are pretty similar. But one of the things that we really focused on was we wanted to elevate the emphasis on the importance of muscle strengthening. Whereas in most guidelines, you see, it's all the aerobic guidelines first, and then at the bottom somewhere, they'll be like, oh, and by the way, do some muscle strengthening twice a week. So I was involved in the review of that, and to their credit, that like they completely flipped the guidelines around. So the emphasis now is on well, it's not, both are presented as being equally important, but the first thing you read is the muscle strengthening guidelines and the UK physical activity guidelines. But anyway, one of the things that we found reviewing the literature was Frequency wise, you could train once, twice, three, four, 5 times a week, and assuming you were hitting a minimum kind of volume in those training sessions, it really didn't make too much difference from a kind of general health perspective as to, whether you were training once a week or 3 times a week or whatever. So we were originally discussing whether or not we should change the guidelines to be once a week as the minimum that people should achieve. And interestingly, there was a lot of debate around that because the worry was if we changed it from 2 times a week down to 1 times a week, people might perceive that as saying, oh, well, it's not so important then, rather than going like, oh, great, I only need to do it once a week. And also the argument that, well, if people see they only have to do it once a week, then if they forget, then, they're less likely to kind of maintain the habit over time. So doing it a little bit more frequently, I think, is something that can be, even if it's not adding benefit, it's in terms of the outcomes, it's something that helps solidify it as a habit. So I tend to kind of tell people, aim for twice a week, and if you want to do more, great. But if you miss a session, don't worry, it's not the end of the world.
We pretty much recommend the same thing in that, you should be averaging about 2 workouts a week. And if you're averaging 2 workouts a week over time, I think number one, for most people, that's bite-sized enough where they feel like they could do it forever.
Yeah.
And that has always been a big part of this conversation that we have, taking research like what you've done and demonstrating to people that I know you think you need to train for 6 hours a week, but you don't. I know you think you need to be in the gym every single day of the week, but you don't. And oftentimes, going back to what we've discussed already, there's like this liberating feeling for a lot of people that, oh, you mean that I actually can get great results and maintain those results over time with this minimal effective dose of, say, two workouts a week. A big part of the conversation, though, that I did want to bring up, because I do think this is important in making these sort of recommendations about training frequency and what's actually necessary and what's not. You've done a lot of research around this concept of reps in reserve. And this, for those who are uninitiated, don't understand this concept. The concept of reps in reserve is that if we as practitioners are telling people, hey, you should train to momentary muscular failure, and as long as you do that for, let's say, X number of exercises twice a week, you're going to maximize your muscle hypertrophy, your strength, your conditioning, all of the beautiful benefits that you get from this. But then you have a group of people that say, well, you don't necessarily need to train that hard. If you stop short of, say, 3 reps, you're still going to get a great benefit. So the reason why I want to bring this up is because I'm not sure people understand how hard they actually need to train in order to benefit from training as little as 2 times a week. And this also ties into other research that you did, which is people are really poor at knowing and understanding whether or not they are training at their max capacity. So if you don't mind kind of blending those things together and helping people to understand this concept better.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, this has been a topic that's been an interest of mine for a long time, probably stemming from when I first got introduced to, or I started resistance training, as most kids do in my young teen years, and then I bumped into James Fisher, who introduced me to all of the old high intensity crowd like Mike Mentor and Arthur Jones and stuff, and I got obsessed with this idea of training hard and training to failure. So it's been stuck in my mind for probably 20 years now, most of my career. But yeah, we've done a lot of work around it. A lot of it originally started because in most research you read, it's really not clear how they have defined momentary failure. So it's difficult to know whether people did or did not train to failure in particular studies, which can make it hard to interpret the results of those studies. And so we did some original work kind of trying to define momentary failure a little bit more clearly, particularly in the context of this kind of, as you said, reps in reserve model that was being used as well. So people were starting to use this model, and it's kind of used in a similar way to a rating of perception of effort is, but instead of you like rating, how much effort you feel like you're putting into it, you give a specific number of how many reps you think you have left in the tank, so to speak. So, if you were to do a set of repetitions to true failure, you actually fail to complete a rep despite attempting to do so with all the effort that you can muster. Then, if you were to fail on the 10th rep and you stopped on the 7th, then you would say, okay, I've got 3 reps in reserve left. And so people started to kind of program training around this concept. But as you say, what we've typically found is that most people are not perfectly accurate at gauging how close to failure they actually are. And we've done a few different studies around this topic now. One of them was another meta-analysis, which I did with my good friend and colleague, Israel Halperin, and where we pooled all of the studies that have looked at this concept of how accurate people are in terms of judging their proximity to failure. And most of these kinds of studies, what they'll do is they'll do exactly what I said there. So they'll kind of ask people at different points during a set, how many reps do you think you've got left? How many reps do you think you've got left? And then they'll ask them to say, tell us when you think you're at 3 reps in reserve or 5 reps in reserve or whatever. And then they'll have them continue to failure. So you can see the difference between what they said they thought they were at and then what they actually were at. And on average, we see that people underjudge it by about a rep. So when people say, I'm 3 reps away from failure, they're probably more like 4 reps away from failure. So it's a difference. It's not massive, but also people get worse the lighter the loads that they're using. So lifting heavy loads, people are better at judging how close to failure they are, probably because you can do fewer reps with heavier loads than you can with lighter loads. So there's less room for error there. But also because typically with lighter loads, if anyone's done a 20 rep set of squats to failure, then people will know it's quite uncomfortable versus say just doing 2 reps or 3 reps or 4 or whatever. Lighter loads to failure produce a lot more discomfort. And we've also done a lot of research showing that. So when you get people to actually differentiate between how hard they are trying to perform the repetition versus how uncomfortable does it feel? Like how much burning is there? How gassed do you feel? All of these kinds of other sort of sensations. Then people are able to differentiate those 2 parts of their perception or parts of their experience. And when they're training with lighter loads to failure, people tend to find that they feel a lot more uncomfortable. So we think that kind of influences people's judgments as well. So there's a lot of reasons why people are maybe not so accurate. But you're also quite right in saying that, I should say as well, actually, we did a really fun little study where we deceived all the participants in the study. They had no idea that we were actually judging how accurate they were in terms of training to failure or predicting their proximity to failure. And one of the things that we had said was most of the studies had not seen how accurate people were at getting as close to failure as they could, but not hitting failure. So what would be called 0 reps in reserve. So if I were to fail on the 10th rep, but I stopped on the 9th rep, then I've got no more reps I could complete in reserve, like as I would fail on the next one. So that would be kind of a 0 reps in reserve concept, which we would call a repetition maximum. Like it's the maximum number of complete repetitions you could do. If you tried the next one, you'd fail. Now, you can't really train to a true repetition maximum because unless you try the next rep, you don't know whether you were going to fail it or not. You might predict you would fail it, but unless you actually fail on it, you don't know. So we always call it a self-determined repetition maximum. We pitched it to the participants as we want to just see how reliable these definitions of set endpoints, as we call them in the literature, are. So, we want to see how reliable, the number of reps people to do to momentary failure are. And we also want to see how reliable people are in terms of stopping, stopping at that 0 reps in reserve. And what we didn't tell them is that we were comparing the 2 to see whether or not they were actually 0 reps in reserve or at self-determined rep max. And in that little study, we did find that again, people are probably a little bit worse than maybe the meta-analysis suggested when you actually blind them to it all and people don't know that that's what you're trying to determine from them. So I think people were probably more closer to maybe 2 reps away when they're judging things. But anyway, to go back to the other point you made, some people will say you don't need to train to failure to optimize adaptations. And in some sense, there is truth to that. Another PhD student of mine has done probably the most up-to-date and rigorous meta-analysis on the topic of how does training to failure or the proximity to failure impact strength gains and hypertrophy gains during resistance track training. And what we typically find, and this is probably partly a result of the way in which strength is what we call operationalized, so the way it's measured in different studies. Typically, it's like a one repetition maximum, where there's a where there's a lot more skill involved with the type of movement that's being performed. And typically, if you're training heavy enough, like you can make reasonable improvements in one repetition maximum without having to worry about training to failure. You can stop a few reps shy, and probably a lot more of the strength gains in those kinds of movements are down to just getting better at doing a one rep max squat or a one rep max bench or whatever. Maybe there's a little bit more of a benefit of training to failure with things like general strength. So, for example, if we were to test it isometrically or using some sort of other dynamometer like we might use in the lab. But when you look at hypertrophy, there's quite a clear dose-response relationship. So the closer you get to failure, the more you see increases in muscle mass, in muscle size. Again, going back to the earlier point though, it's all very small. Like growing muscle is quite hard. Otherwise, everyone would look like Mr. Olympia. And there's very few people walking around looking like that. We'll drugs and stuff aside. But the benefits are pretty small, but there is definitely a dose-response relationship whereby you will gain greater increases in muscle mass the closer to failure you train. Now, whether the difference between stopping, say, 1 or 2 reps short of failure versus train to failure is big enough to care about is also another thing where it's like, okay, maybe it's not a big enough difference to worry about. But if we combine all of this together and think about what does it practically mean? Well, if people are pretty bad at judging how close to failure they are, and they're maybe 1 to 2 reps shy, and we look at the dose response relationship and say, well, if they were stopping maybe 1 or 2 reps short of failure, then they're probably still getting almost as good a gains as they would get. And maybe the difference between that and training to failure is not big enough to care about. But the reality is, in practice, most people are probably training a bit further than 1 to 2 reps shy of failure when they think they're training 1 to 2 reps shy of failure. And so my practical recommendation is always being, look, even if training to failure did not produce massively meaningfully more improvements in muscle size, strength, etc. It's still worth aiming for that, because at the very least, you have crossed whatever threshold there may be, you've maximized whatever stimulus there might be, and you've not left anything on the table. So, it's cliche, but it's kind of like a, shoot for the star, aim for the stars, and you might reach the moon sort of thing. Most people also struggle with going there, with putting the effort in to get to failure. But I think if they aim for it, they're going to get as close as they can feasibly get. And having a great trainer, obviously helps them with that. I can talk maybe a little bit about some interesting data that we've got from my work with my new role with Kieser in Australia, where we've been looking at the effects of kind of training with a trainer versus training unsupervised. And I think definitely in that sense, our data kind of suggests that people train a lot harder when they're training with a trainer than when they're unsupervised as well. But yeah, in terms of the effort, I think, most people are not good judges of their own effort. And so it's better for them to go like, right, I'm going to aim for that target, going to try and get to failure. If I get there, great. If I don't quite get there, I at least know I've got as far as I can. If I'm struggling to get there, then a good trainer will help me get there, or maybe, using some other kind of advanced techniques or something like that to kind of eke out a little bit more effort can be useful. But yeah, I think when you bring this all together, it makes for a nice, simple kind of practical application again as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, so basically, building muscle is difficult unless you're resistance training is kind of what we can take out of this.
Well, it's pretty much impossible without resistance training.
Agree.
And then even with resistance training, once you hit a certain threshold, it's going to be really hard to eke out any more beyond that. 2
to 3 days a week, 30 minutes to momentary muscular failure. It's so weird that that's our business model. I love it.
It's almost like you guys, are making it an evidence-based, science-based model.
Yeah, amazing. Lots of science.
Who knew?
I did have a couple of questions, and I did want to hit on that trainer versus unsupervised. What I wanted to know, these reps in reserve. So basically, I've experienced this personally with Mike, where I'm like, I can only do 10 reps, and if he's there coaching me, like I can get to 13, 15. There's definitely so much more I can eke out. What I want to know is, in your research, did you notice a difference in people's age or gender? Like, was it that like the women had more to push out than the men? Like, were there any like weird things that you noticed in that research?
Yeah, so to be honest, there's probably not enough data to be able to tease out those kinds of differences with any degree of confidence at the moment. I can probably say anecdotally that like I'm often surprised that like some of the men I've trained personally in the past don't bring it as much as some of the women do. Not all though, not all. You get a lot of variation there, but on average, I think it's difficult for us to say one way or the other at the moment. I think there's probably a lot more individual, just individual person to person differences than there are necessarily kind of anything that's kind of explained by that. I think there will probably again, it's difficult to say because there's not enough research that's been done across, for example, the age spectrum on this topic in particular. So again, it's tough to say like, are older adults kind of better or worse at this? If I were a betting man, I would probably say that they were probably a bit worse, partly because the older people get there's a little bit more kind of like fear involved with kind of pushing themselves too hard, and I think there's kind of a lot of kind of social reasons for that. The sort of way people think about their bodies and what they're capable of as they age. But yeah, it's not easy to tease out anything direct there. I think from the research, I think there's probably more that needs to be done to test whether there are those sorts of differences.
It makes sense completely. And I do want to get into, unless you had another question.
Well, no, I just wanted to make a statement that, again, totally anecdotal, but what I would say is, just from my observations, is that if we're talking about working with a heavy weight load, I think men tend to do better in terms of pushing to or getting closer to momentary muscular failure than women, tied also to that concern maybe of injuring themselves with a heavier weight. Yet, if we're using a lighter weight load and it's a longer, more enduring set, women tend to fare much better with regards to judging how much more they have left in the tank compared to men. And I'll just say that I observed it this morning where I had a brand new guy show up, and we don't typically just interject somebody into one of our group sessions, but we did because I knew I'd be able to work with him individually. And so the sets are all timed. So everybody's going for the same amount of time, and the weight loads are, again, they're chosen predictably where this person's going to be at or near failure by the end of, say, 60 seconds. And it's always interesting to me that him training alongside all of these women, at about 45 seconds or so, he's constantly putting the weight stack down, having to take a rest, shake out his muscles, and the women just keep going. They do not stop.
That's why we have babies, by the way.
Well,
I was going to say, it's almost like there's an evolutionary reason for this.
Yeah. I mean, so I do think that there is this, even though the research might not be teasing it out right now, I would say that many of us who've been working with both men and women for, a couple decades or so, like, you start to recognize that there are these differences.
Well, and again, we'll say, like, that's it. But if I have a trainer there, if I have Mike there, well, I typically don't like to have Mike there because he makes me cry. But typically, like, if they're like, come on, you got like one or two more, like, I'll find myself finding the gas, so to speak, to be able to eke those out, which is just amazing to me. So I do want to get into that, knowing that you've researched what is the difference between training on your own, unsupervised, or having a professional that's there.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of, again, we've done some work on this, mostly led by great colleague and friend James Fisher, who's been on the podcast before, I think.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, if you've not talked about supervision in particular, you should definitely get him on to talk about that as well, because he's done a few really nice projects recently where he's been exploring a little bit more kind of people's perceptions of supervision, and part of this has come because the first project we did was we did again a meta-analysis where part of the reason we do a lot of these is because it's a good place to start when you're sort of venturing into a new field or a new research topic, to say, like, what has come before, what do we know, what are the questions that still remain, and again, in that, like, there's actually not a huge amount of research, surprisingly, unless you start looking at kind of very clinical populations where they typically compare things like home-based training versus, training in a kind of exercise facility with supervision. So there's more going on there than just the supervision. But there's actually not a huge amount of research that's compared over time the adaptations to training with a trainer versus not. But what we do see is that at least for kind of strength outcomes, there's probably a benefit for training with a trainer, and whether that's because they push them a bit harder or whether that's because they're better able to coach their technique and the exercise and so on, there could be a lot of reasons for that. But certainly in terms of, like, the like the acute, like the experience, like right there and then of training with versus without a trainer. Trainer makes such a difference to it, and a lot of James Fisher's research recently, where he has conducted some survey work with some large samples of trainees and with trainers, are kind of teasing that out. Exactly what we kind of already know, but it's nice to see it kind of reflected in the research. Is to say, most people like to have a trainer because it helps them push themselves harder. It helps. It's almost a bit of a commitment device to make sure you turn up. It is funny. My wife used to say that she'd be like if she's left her own devices, like she wouldn't train at all. But she doesn't like to let someone down if she's booked something in. So it's a good commitment device that way. But certainly in terms of pushing themselves there and then, a trainer is really able to do that and do so safely as well, and to make sure that the exercise technique is appropriate. Because you see some people in the gym will kind of train hard, but as things get harder, things get a little bit more sloppy, and you start to worry about injuries. But in terms of some of the data that we're and I should be writing this up to publish in the new year. This is actually a study I did with Keyser before I worked for Keyser. We did this a few years back, and it's just been on the back burner to actually publish. But at Keyser, the model they have is they have a few different kinds of memberships, and one of those is the core membership, where all of the new members will have 6 supervised sessions to begin with, and then after that they're able to train on their own in the facility, and they'll have a regular review session every 10 sessions. So every 10 sessions they'll have another supervised session to go through, do some strength testing with them, reassess their program and check on their progress and so on. But the majority of their training is unsupervised in the facility. There's staff on the floor and stuff like that who are kind of keeping an eye on them, and if someone's doing something not quite right, they'll interject, but by and large they train on their own. And then we also have the assisted memberships, which are exactly as they sound. You have a certain number of sessions, typically once or twice a week, where you will train with a trainer. And it's interesting, ever since I started my new role with Keyser, I've been talking to a lot of the clinicians, a lot of the exercise scientists who work on the floor, and trying to sort of, I've been trying to sort of prioritize, like, what are the kind of research projects we want to do now I'm in this kind of head of research role with Keyser, and asking them, well, what are some of the things you face on the floor? What are some of the problems you face? What are some of the things that we could do some research in to try and understand how best to solve these problems? And almost all of them say, I don't think people train hard enough. Like they're yeah, particularly the ones who are training unsupervised. Like Keyser have a time under load target. So or the program that they use is a kind of 90 to 120 second time under load. And the idea is it's supposed to be a typical double progression. So, you start off with a load. That means you fail between that target range of 90 to 120 seconds. And then once you hit the top end of that and you're failing at over 120 seconds, you increase the load and you keep doing that. But the idea is you keep training to failure and progressing in that way. You progress the time of the load, you progress the load, etc. But what they've been noticing is a lot of the core trainees will just kind of stick at the same load that they're training at. They'll hit their 120 second target and go like, oh, great, I've hit my target, and I'll stop there. And so I went back to this old data where we compared, we had a number of our core trainees. They were told, right, you need to train to failure, but you're going to train to failure on your own. Keyser have this nice app that they use to record everything, so it tracks the time under load and things like that. And then we had them also train with a supervised session as well. And I looked at the time under loads that they were achieving, and in the core session, can you guess what the mean time under load is? It's exactly 120 seconds. Like pretty much everyone just stops when they hit their 120. A few of the more motivated ones also went on to about, well, like 300 plus seconds time under load, which suggests that they definitely aren't using the heavy the loads that they should be. And yeah, under the assisted supervised training, they were getting more around the kind of 175 to 180 second time under load. So most people are probably not using enough weight and probably stopping far short of failure, even at Keyser. So some of our next steps are going to be like, right, what are we going to do operationally now to make sure that, well, one, we kind of highlight to customers like, you might want to sign up for the assisted membership because you might be leaving a lot of benefit on the table. But also, how do we maybe come up with some ways in which, for those who are training untrained, what can we provide unsupervised, sorry, what can we offer to them as tips and tricks that might help them push themselves a little bit further as well?
That makes a whole lot of sense. And I think it's
Yeah.
such a great benchmark for people that are training. If you're going for 300 seconds, I mean, you're going for 5 minutes doing the same exercise, and that is entirely too long. I mean, we're looking in our studio, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think the ideal is anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds.
Yeah, that's pretty much on average.
It's literally a minute to a minute and a half for exercise.
And I think this, though, it just brings up such an interesting point because, and I know there's no way to really flesh this out and to give exact percentages, but like theoretically, like how much progress do you think people are leaving on the table because they're not training basically hard enough? Because I guess this is the thing that, as a practitioner, as somebody who's owned fitness studios, what I see all the time is you get that person coming in who, say, has been doing an exercise program for a very long time. They've been consistent and they're absolutely floored that in a few short sessions, they're able to suddenly have these breakthroughs that they haven't been able to achieve in years. And a lot of it I would just attribute to not a magical fitness program because there's nothing magical about it, but just this focus on training hard enough. And I think that goes back to my earlier question, like, and how hard do people really need to be training in order to see some of the results that they're looking for when they first begin a program?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really hard to put like an exact number on there. Like we can make some rough kind of guesstimates based on, like I say, some of the meta-analysis data that we've got. So if I go back to my student Zach Robinson's meta-regression work on proximity to failure, I mean, you probably, if I make some crude calculations, if we say people, particularly if I take, for example, the Kieser folk, like, if really they're using a load that means that they fail around 180 seconds, but they're training more to like 120, then they're probably getting somewhere around like 60 to 70% of the gains that they're getting if we assume that kind of linear dose response relationship. So yeah, there's definitely like, and I think if you said to people, there's probably 30% of the gains that you could be getting that you're leaving on the table if you're not training hard enough. People would go, oh, okay, well that's actually like a big enough, amount to care about. I think if you said, you might get like 5% more out if you train a bit harder, but it will be harder. Then maybe some people will go like, I'm okay with what I've got at the moment. I'm happy with my level of effort. I'm happy with the level of gains that I'm getting. But I think definitely, left to their own devices, and this isn't everyone, like I should say, like I'm one of the weirdos who could train in like a white room with no distractions, completely silent, and push myself to failure. But you have to be a real weirdo to do that sort of thing. So I appreciate that not everyone is as strange and kind of masochistic as I am.
Are you going to agree with him? Because you could do that too.
I mean, I 100% agree. And, maybe this is getting into the weeds and this is a little bit of my own, I want to understand a little bit better myself. And that is, I find myself now, I mean, after having trained for several decades now, so probably started training with weights at around 13 years old, I'm 47. So I've been pretty consistent with this, and I will jump into our own classes because, sometimes I don't have the motivation that I used to have, say 20 years ago, to be as masochist as I was once then. But what I find myself doing, though, is reaching a point, maybe it's on certain exercises or just in general, saying, this is my weight load. This is my weight load for this particular exercise, and not necessarily pushing for more. The way that I once had. And, talk to me about what are the potential repercussions of that, or do you reach a point where I've hit my genetic limit, I'm probably not going to get any stronger, should I just be trying to maintain that weight load from workout to workout?
I mean, I definitely think that is the case. Like I can speak a bit to my own kind of personal journey around this as well. I think I realized very early on that things aren't shifting, and came to terms with that fairly quickly. And I think now we have quite overwhelming data from the research that suggests that's the case. I mean, one of the big projects I was involved in was a study with Fit20, who are a Dutch company who provide minimal dose kind of high intensity training. So it's all low frequency, low volume, single set to failure type stuff. And there we see that, we had 7 years worth of data, 15,000 participants, and pretty much most of the strength gains that we saw in that population are within the sort of first year or so. Things do shift over time, but they become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually it gets to a point where it's very difficult to make noticeable improvements. But we see this also, like we've also done some work looking at the open powerlifting data set, which is you can track powerlifters like over years and years and years. And the good thing about powerlifting is it's basically just a competition where everyone does a strength test. And so if you compare their performance over time, the vast majority of powerlifters are probably already been resistance training as well. And what we see is kind of, if you imagine like over time, I don't know if I'm going to be going left to right or right to left on your screen now, but if you have time kind of on your x-axis and strength kind of does this, like over time, then maybe at some point in your training career, you go, oh, I'm going to start doing powerlifting, and you kind of hit this plateau, but then you get a little bump, and then it will start to plateau again, partly because you're now training like a specific lift that you're trying to maximize the loads that you're using on. And so this comes back to that kind of skill element with it. But you still see in those populations as well, very quickly a plateauing of performance. And I mean, again, to go back to my kind of personal experience, at the much to the disgust of a lot of people in the kind of like HIIT sphere, I stopped tracking my workouts like years ago because I got really bored of like writing the same numbers down every single time. It was like weights aren't going up. I'm hitting failure at the same time. Like I've tried everything under the sun, and I've now got really bored of writing the same stuff down.
We could be training partners. James, you and me could be training partners. I gave up on that, and I hate to say this, probably close to a decade ago, because the same thing. I was like, what am I trying for here? And also, having that understanding, if I get any better at this exercise, chances are it's just because I'm getting better at the exercise and not because I'm doing my scans, my in-bodies, I'm checking my body composition, and I'm not eking out any more muscle just because I'm using 5 or 10% more weight load for any set of exercises. So if that's the case, then what am I doing here? Like, isn't the more important thing, going back to the beginning of this conversation, to train hard? Isn't it more important that I'm putting my focus on pushing myself to or as close to momentary muscular failure despite the weight? And if I'm doing that, am I doing everything that I should be doing in order to maximize whatever I do have left, or at the very worst, maintain what I currently have?
Yeah, I think this comes back around to like the freedom that you have now as well. Well, when you realize, particularly when you realize you're on the maintenance trajectory now. And I love the term, I'm going to completely mind blank on the author's name, but the book is called Bending the Aging Curve, and the author's name is completely mind blanking now. But this is where I think if you imagine that kind of like trajectory over time as well, I mean, we saw the same trajectory in older adults as well. But really, if you're not training, what should be happening is that over that time. So one way to reframe it is if you are maintaining over time, after you hit a certain age, like you can look at that as gaining really, because what should be happening is a decline, and if you're staying on that trajectory, that's good. But again, it comes back to going like, well, yeah, it probably doesn't matter if you're. I mean, we also do know that load has very little impact on hypertrophy anyway, assuming that you're training to momentary failure. The only difference is become practical. It's like, do you also have specific strength goals for a specific exercise? I.e., you're a powerlifter who has to get good at the free lifts and shifting heavy loads in them. Okay, well, you should probably train them. If you're not, well, don't worry about it. If you're a masochist like me and you like doing wall sits to failure, then go ahead and do that. But if you don't like your legs feeling like they're filled full of acid, then maybe use a little bit of a heavier weight, use some lighter loads, and play around with it. So James Fisher used to do this thing where now I train in my garage at home. I'm a creature of habit now with that. Like I say, very minimal distractions and whatnot. But every now and then, I'll venture into a public gym and normally go like, this is why I don't train in public gyms. But James Fisher used to do this thing where if he was time pressed, he would just go to all the machines he needed to train on, and whatever the load was that whoever was using it previously had left it on, he'd just train with that. And so he'd use it just as the excuse to kind of get a bit of kind of variety and see how, just make it a little bit fun. And sometimes I do the same as well. Sometimes here I'll go like, do you know what? Like instead of loading it up to the load I normally use, which I've used for like the last 10 years, because I'm not getting any stronger than that. Like I might use a little bit less, or maybe I'll add a bit more, but I'll do a lower rep set or something like that, just for the fun of it. But really in my mind, I'm like, this is now just to keep it interesting for me, because for a whole training career, unless you're incredibly intrinsically motivated, then it is hard to continue to engage in the behavior when you're no longer making obvious improvements that like are really noticeable, and you think, now, wow, I feel stronger, wow, I look so much better in the mirror, and so on. So it becomes important to kind of focus on how do you keep yourself motivated to keep going at some point in your career once you're no longer seeing those kind of drastic changes.
I love this conversation, and we do have to wrap here, but this has just been such an encouraging conversation. Whether, the listener, you're a trainer, you're training right now, maybe you're scared to get back in there with a professional. It's 1, 2, or 3 days a week, as little as 30 minutes, pushing yourself to failure. You can continue to maintain, because that really is the biggest goal. I mean, that's our currency going into age. It's not the insurance of money, right? Because that can disappear. And I think people on their deathbed would always say, like, I would give it all to just have more time. Like, we always want to carry as much muscle as we possibly can, because that assists with our aging and our ability to enjoy our life. So we so appreciate your research and everything that you do and spending your time with us. This is so enjoyable. Thank you, James.
Yeah, thank you so much. There was so many great takeaways, everything from what Corey Beth just summed up. And I think too, it should encourage people that no matter what condition you're in, if you're injured, right? Like we started the conversation just talking about range of motion and how there is such a wide variety out there for people. I think it's great. So James, thank you so much. This has been an awesome conversation. Lots of fun.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's also nice to come on and have an encouraging, positive conversation about it, because I think some corners of the online community have been looking at a lot of our recent research and thinking that we're just being too negative, saying, "Wait, it's hard to gain muscle when you've already been training for 15 years." Yeah, but that's not a bad thing. So it's nice to have an encouraging, positive conversation with you guys and look at the benefits of things even over the long term.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And everyone, I'm gonna actually drop in the show notes some links to some of James's work, because I think it's outstanding for those of you who like to nerd out on that, like I do. That is specifically for you. So once again, James, thank you, and everybody have a phenomenal day.